Good morning. Let us
Good
gather
morning.
ourselves in the presence of God. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, by whose Spirit the whole body of your faithful people is governed and sanctified, receive our supplications and prayers which we offer before you for all members of your holy church, that in their vocation and ministry they may truly and devoutly serve you. Through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Dios Todopoderoso y Eterno, cuyo Espíritu gobierna y santifica a todo el cuerpo de tu pueblo fiel. Recibe las súplicas y oraciones que te ofrecemos por todos los miembros de tu Santa Iglesia, para que en su vocación y ministerio te sirvan verdadera y devotamente, por nuestro Señor y Salvador Jesucristo, que vive y reina contigo en la unidad del Espíritu Santo, un solo Dios, ahora y por siempre. Amén.
Well, good morning. On behalf of the SEEP Conference Planning Team, it's my privilege to welcome all of you to this workshop, Strategic Conversations, Flexibility, and Rapid Execution. It is my privilege to introduce you to the moderator of this discussion and my colleague, Karen Kraseric, a fellow member of the SEEP Conference Planning Team and a fellow administrator as well. With that, Karen, please take it away.
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate you. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you've joined us this morning. I know Paul and Laura Lynn and I are excited to have this conversation. Briefly, Paul and Laura Lynn, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Paul, if you'd start for us.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning. I'm Paul. Who likes good food? I do. Who likes good wine? I do. Now you know a lot about me, so we don't need to worry about that. Today we're discussing three things: strategy, communications, and operations. All three of us could do all of it. Today I'm the strategy guy. I founded and run PIR Consulting, and I serve as a member of the leadership of the Episcopal Church in Bethesda by the Sea in sunny Palm Beach in Florida. I focus mainly on strategy, and I'm also the chair of stewardship. And I also look at any of the areas the rector decides are not doing what they're supposed to.
Thank you, Paul. Laura Lynn?
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you all. My name is Laura Lynn Lee. I have worked as a consultant for the last 5 years to large institutional churches and institutions of higher education, museums. My clients tend to be large. Many of the SEEP congregations are characteristic of my clients. I do also, like Paul, do work around strategy and organizational change work, but I have a particular focus on engagement and communications, and that's what I'm going to get to talk to you about today. I am currently serving as interim chief of staff at the National Cathedral, where I have been a longtime consultant, and I've also had the privilege of working with Bishop Mary Ann Buddy at the Episcopal Diocese of Washington and a number of SEEP parishes. So I'm really delighted to be able to join you all, and regret that we're not in person, but glad that we have this context.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura Lynn. And everyone, I'm Karen Kraseric. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer and the Minister for Stewardship here at Christ Church Cathedral in Houston. As Zach mentioned, I'm also a member of the SEEP Planning Committee, and this is my 5th SEEP conference. This is my first church I have worked for. I've been here about 6 years. Prior to the Chief Administrative Officer role, I served as the Minister for Community Life for about 4.5 years. So as Paul said, all of us could talk about all of these topics. And so we're excited to bring them to you in a conversation today. First, I want to acknowledge that we have folks from all over the country and that everybody's in a different place. Whether you're in person for worship, whether you're not allowed back in your building, there is nothing that's going to be one size fits all. So we just want to acknowledge that up front. We may talk about what has worked in our particular parishes or with the clients we've worked with, but know that you can take away anything from this conversation, and hopefully it's a jumping off point for you and your church leadership to start a conversation. You'll need to evaluate what makes sense for the congregation that you serve, where you are, and what is possible financially. And we also offer you, we ask you to post questions in the chat. Definitely use that chat feature. I know several of you already are, and so I'll continue to help monitor that throughout the conversation. The way we're gonna format the workshop today is Paul, Laura Lynn, and I will each present about a 5 to 7 minute overview of our topics of specialization. And then we'll ask for feedback or ideas, encourage questions, and then kind of have a conversation between the three of us based on the things that you guys want to talk more about. So definitely use that chat feature, and feel free to let us know what you're thinking. So Paul, I'm going to ask that you kick us off with your presentation first, to talk about rapid execution.
Okay. Rapid execution sounds like we've worked out what we want to do and we're going to jump straight into it. I'm a big proponent that if you don't know what the right questions are, the answers are usually wrong. And so before we get to the answers, let's actually step back a bit and take a broad perspective in terms of what the questions might be. Talking to lots of people, both within Bethesda Church where I attend and in the wider world, a lot of people talk about missing in-person church services. Less often they mention missing fellowship in hospitality, formation activities, and all the other parts of whatever our church is doing. I'm sure it's different for each of us. There's no one answer. So through the chat side, why don't you actually let us know what the one thing that you miss the most because of COVID. Now, COVID is one of the things we could have talked about today, and there are lots of others. When I was putting the plan together for Bethesda for 2021, it was, well, it could be climate change, and obviously what we've encountered over the last few weeks. We probably all learned way more about polar vortexes and things like that than we ever thought was possible. Could be racial justice and reconciliation, it could be the political divide, but we've narrowed the big picture down to COVID for today. But even that is different based on the geography, the politics of your church, the demographics, the scale of it. We have about 1,500 members at Bethesda, so we're a good mid-sized church. Karen and Laura Lynn come from cathedrals, so it's a different dimension again. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone who's looking after the 25-member church and things like that, but we'll see what we can do. In terms of geography, here in Palm Beach, part of our congregation comes from Palm Beach, i.e. the proper place. And part of it is across the water, that's the intercoastal in the United States of America. So from a facetious viewpoint, even within our church, there are two very different demographics. And we have a lot of people who are older. I'm in my 60s, so I can talk about people being older when they're in their 80s. And we have about 400 people who are over 80. So on the basis that we can't in 1 hour come up with one answer for you for strategy or communications or operations, let's look at some of the big picture challenges from COVID. In terms of reduced income, I'm sure most churches have actually suffered that problem in terms of less money coming in. Money in the plate in terms of cash, someone who actually contributes through a check once a month by putting it into the plate have all gone away. The reduced in-person interaction and mask wearing, you hear a lot in the news in terms of people who feel lonely. I have to really work hard to actually understand that. My wife and I, Sandra, are very happy. We've actually worked together on occasions. Most of the time we haven't. And if we don't actually see anybody else, it's not really a problem. My wife needs to see other dogs. We have one dog. My wife needs to see other dogs every day. But there are 50 in our apartment complex, so that's not really a problem. Reduced outreach financial giving capability. I put this one because it's very specific to Bethesda. We have a resale store. It's about as far away as you can get from a dollar store. We're in Palm Beach, and a lot of the contributions are designer dresses. So someone buys a Chanel dress for $5,000, wears it twice, can't possibly wear it again, and therefore donates it to us. Sometimes they're members and sometimes they're members of the community. Our income from the church's net income that we then give 100% to outreach is normally in the $500,000 to $600,000 a year level. It will have dropped by 50%, and therefore our ability to help other organizations, nonprofits in Palm Beach County and Florida as a whole has gone enormously down. Becoming more reactive than proactive. You build a strategic plan, you know exactly what you're going to do. We built ours back in 2012. In 2019, we updated the 5-year strategic plans, and we launched it in January at our annual meeting. And in February, a thing called COVID came along, and it was like, what are we going to do about that? Now, what we did, I'll talk about later. But it's very easy to go into reactive mode. Our income's gone down, so we have to cut our costs. We're not seeing one another. What are we going to do? All the other challenges that come up. So again, if there's a specific challenge that you have at your church, just send one, okay? Because we already have a lot of people on here, and about one each is all we can cope with. And then along the same lines, it's very easy to forget your vision, your mission, and your values, and simply focus on what are we going to do tomorrow? And what can we do next week? And forget whether or not it's consistent with the long-term picture. So if you look at all of that, you go, so what are the real questions that you're trying to address for your church, for your community? What are the 2 or 3 things that in the short term you need answers to, but in the medium and long term you need answers to? Send us in something and we'll see how clever we are in terms of reacting to all those questions and giving you answers in the second part of this. Just something else I want to say at this stage. Part of this is, who do you actually engage with when you're actually trying to work out what the right questions are for you? And I believe it's exactly the same to do that as it is to actually build a strategy and then implement it in terms of change. You have a core team that's part of your leadership. You deliberately don't include all your leadership. You count your leadership as your wardens and vestry and officers and your rector or other clergy or lay associates. You want it to be part of that, and you start to craft your questions, and then you bring the rest in who don't know anything about what you were doing, apart from the fact you were doing it, and you ask them what they think. And I've always found that if you actually use part of your leadership, it's almost like a quality assurance side of things, of a reality bit. The first group goes off on their cumulus cloud space, and then the other people come in with reality. You test this with other leaders, then you test it with others in terms of demographics and geography. And then you get to the communication side. I'm not going to say too much about that, Laura Lynn will. But there's a process, there's a set of conclusions, and there's a plan. And how do you communicate those 3 things? And whom do you communicate them to? And when do you do that? So as a starter for 10, what are the right questions? When you came here today, what was the one question you wanted to answer in terms of how do I actually stop being so reactive, still manage our church and lead our church, and how do we go forwards? So that's my first piece, and I'll hand over to Laura Lynn now.
Thanks, Paul. Laura Lynn?
Thanks. It's great again to be with you all, and thank you, Paul. So I'm going to talk a little bit about communications, and I'm going to talk about it in 2 contexts. We will spend some time, as Paul was highlighting, thinking about how we all do strategic planning and pivoting in responding strategically to what is an ever-changing set of circumstances. But I'm also sensitive that for many of us in our parishes, communication has never been more important. It is always, as Paul alluded, critically important to a good strategic planning process. And we can talk a little bit about that for those of you who are continuing or considering planning processes at this time. Right now, though, for many of us, including those at the Washington National Cathedral, we're still physically closed. So the only way we are able to gather is by thinking about the tools of our communication, by using technology in new ways, and to being really creative in how we reach out to those audiences that we serve and to our internal constituencies, including our staff. So I'm going to talk about communication and how we think about intentional communication in this context right now. And then I'm also happy to focus a little bit more in the Q&A period about how we think about communications and engagement in a planning process to the extent that that's helpful to you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for what would be a fairly. So one important thing, I think, as we all think about in community, let me take just a step back for a moment. When we all abruptly shut our doors about a year ago, I think many of us as parishes were forced to think very differently about how we lead a worship life, how we reach out to parishioners in need, how we even support our own staffs. And we went almost immediately to how do you use technology to do that, right? How do we start using our websites? How do you email people? How are we worshiping on Zoom? And the one piece that I think we have come back to at the cathedral consistently is that while we went immediately in a rush to think about how we move fully virtually, and we're fortunate to be able to do that fairly successfully, at the end of the day, the fundamentals, when you think about communication, are relatively unchanged. And it's important as we think about now about how we effectively reach people to keep our eyes on those balls. We still all need to think about what are the goals of this communication effort? Why am I communicating? What am I hoping that people will hear? And who am I trying to communicate to? Because what we're finding is that very often that informs how we communicate with an eye towards what you really need them to hear. What's essential that you need them to hear? What do you want people to hear? The audience question in our context, we found to be very important. And that relates, and it plays out in a lot of different ways, especially as now we all function in this virtual context. First of all, we are finding that it makes a lot of difference to think about different generations, right? That many of our constitutional constituencies are older and hadn't been very familiar with technology. And so recognizing that we need to continue to be able to reach our audiences in traditional ways as well as through technology has been important. And then also, as we've been able to expand to an audience that is increasingly national, global, and virtual, we're recognizing that there's lots of flexibility in the way that people are using technologies, and that people from different generations come to receive communication in different ways. They're comfortable using it in different ways. I mean, one of the interesting contexts, I think, even is what we're doing right now. I mean, a year ago, we did not all comfortably sit around at a conference looking at a computer screen and chatting in questions. But I've now run dozens of these where we'll have hundreds of participants on a Zoom screen, and there's a whole method to the madness of how you manage the chats, how do you feed the questions, how do you try to make it an interactive experience. I do a lot of work in the higher ed context. And I will tell you, my anticipation is that all of those of us who grow up not in front of computer screens all the time will be very polite about the way that we put in our questions, and we're unlikely to interrupt ourselves with a constant buzz of chats. When we're talking to a bunch of 20-somethings, there is a constant, the ongoing pitter patter and chatter that goes on in a virtual environment is not a bit disrespectful. It is literally a way that we're seeing a happily engaged crowd. So just recognizing that the way in which we communicate generationally and as we reach out to different audiences has been an important consideration. The other thing that I think that we have needed to be very sensitive to at the cathedral is that our audiences are different, and they come to us for different reasons, and they come to us in different ways. And that we've needed to be sensitive to what the different needs of those external audiences are, but equally right now, really attentive to our own staff, and in the parishes I work with, to our vestry, and to the folks who are helping manage the day-to-day of the church, because as those of us who've been involved in that know, that's really challenging right now. So the internal and communications have been as important as the external communications, and thinking about that from an audience perspective has been very important. As we think about audience, what I've found is that really is helpful if you use this basic fundamentals of like, what are you trying to achieve with your communication, to identify what you need it to do. Do you need to share information? Do you need to engage people? Do you need to do some kind of presentation? Do you need to do it in an engaging way that can be interactive? So really thinking about what are the fundamental goals for that communication is really important in helping define how best to do it. And I've given you here sort of a kit of tools of possible ideas for communication. I don't think anybody's really cracked the nut on how to make this virtual context perfect for any of us, but there has been an increasingly creative range of ways in which parishes have been able to communicate. And I think as we've seen some of those come to life, it's struck me as worth sharing. So here I've made a quick list of some of those that I've seen be effective in for the purpose of sharing information, including just a little reminder not to forget the old-fashioned analog means of communications, that things like phone trees and socially distant walks and good old-fashioned newsletters and letters are still working for some of our constituencies and still needed for those who don't have access to technology or are not as comfortable with technology. But for those of us who have become more comfortable in this virtual world, there are a whole range of things that many of which you're equally familiar with, in which we can do presentation kind of style work. This is an example of a YouTube live public conversation around race that we did at the cathedral. And then an increasing number of ways in which we find we're able to engage and interact with people virtually. So this kind of virtual meeting where we're going to hope that we will be able to have a facilitated conversation through a chat is one good example. But as you know, a bunch of different technologies now allow virtual breakout rooms. We've been quite successful in some of my planning work doing real-time polling, crowdsourcing, having interactive websites, engaged social media where you're responsive to people as they talk during a live event, where some of these technologies really do, in a way that is increasingly less and less awkward as we all get used to it, offer that kind of engagement. So as we look towards the future, and I was noting in the chat that some of the good thoughts that a number of you were having about trying to identify what has actually worked for us in this last year that we want to retain going forward, and also what do we want to return to that we're missing. And I, like you, am missing, many of you mentioned that you're missing that in-person experience, the opportunity to be in relationship and to be in presence with our fellow congregants and parishioners. And I think many of us are keenly missing that, and we'll look forward to returning to that. We are anticipating, though, at the National Cathedral, and I'm anticipating that a number of you as larger churches where you have been successful in having a virtual worship experience, that we are going to be a hybrid cathedral going forward, that we're anticipating that our virtual life will continue, and starting to think very intentionally about how we enter a new normal in that hybrid context, recognizing that a good virtual presence isn't just a replication of the physical experience, that it's actually a specifically virtual experience, and how we are able to continue and create that while we also return to our physical community. We're also being really sensitive to think about what is appropriate to continue. We started a lot of things in an effort, in a kind of flurry of effort to reach out to people, to create a virtual worship community, and sustaining some of those things is really demanding on our resources, on our staff time, and that we need to do a sort of an intentional evaluation of what is having the impact that we wanted to have and what might make sense to scale back as we think about the future. And so that kind of sustainability question is another one that I'll be interested in your thoughts about. So Karen, that actually seems like an appropriate segue to move over to you so you can talk about fundraising and operations and resource development.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Laura Lynn. Okay, I am going to share my screen now. Let's see.
Go on.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about operations and fundraising, and I've sort of tucked personnel under operations as well. So in regards to struggles, particularly with COVID-19, I think we've all experienced some of the same things. For me, managing empty buildings is one of the top struggles. I thought it would be easier to manage an empty building. It is actually infinitely more difficult. The fewer people you have around to catch things that are potentially going wrong, small leaks, light bulbs out, doors that don't close, just the infinite amount of work that pops up. We have been able to accomplish some really important capital maintenance project while the building or the campus was less occupied. However, boredom and complacency tends to set in among facility staff. It's hard to motivate housekeepers to keep cleaning when there's not really people to keep cleaning after. We were a 7-day-a-week, 22-hour-a-day operation that has slowed to a 6 days a week, roughly 12 hours a day operation. When you've got a team of facility staff who are used to running and going at a certain pace, after a year of sort of falling back into a really sleepy pace, it takes extra work to keep those folks motivated, to make sure that the accountability is still there. And then the costs of upkeep, short-term and long-term. We have a 2-block campus that roughly accumulates to about 400,000 square feet. I'm not quite sure how we did it with a team of 7 people, but we're still having to upkeep that same amount of square footage day in and day out with a shorter time frame and just not as much activity. And then there's also the short-term investments without knowing their tenure, right? The PPE that we've had to invest in, the additional hand sanitizer that we've had to invest in. When we were in March of last year, we were trying to make sort of subtle non-permanent changes because we thought that this would potentially go away by the summer. Well, here we are a year later. And at one point we had to just make that decision. I need to invest in better signage that is able to communicate the safety policies and protocols that people need to know about when they're on campus. We've all kind of had that moment where, okay, this is not a 6-week thing. This is not a 3-month thing. This is no longer a 6-month thing. And then having to make those decisions around what to invest in versus what to sort of ad hoc together in the moment. I know for us, one of the cost-saving measures of not having to order coffee with as much frequency has been helpful, but that the coffee does not nearly cover the cost of the hand sanitizer. So that's really been a struggle for us. Also, the extreme influx of technology. There's the increased cost of the hardware, the installation, the labor to get things up and running. We started doing pre-recorded worship with a couple of Mevo cameras and an iPad, and then ultimately installed a live stream system that now not only took funds to implement, now takes additional funds to have a contract technician run every Sunday for 10 hours a day. That was an investment we were already looking into prior to COVID, and it just sped up the process infinitely. Subscriptions and accounts. We went from 1 Zoom account to 15 Zoom accounts, and now a couple of webinar accounts, and each one of those costs additional cash. And you can do them on a month-to-month basis, you can do them on an annual basis, but still, that's a budget item that wasn't there before. Supply and demand. I know that many of us have thought about how do we, have just thought about the availability of technology. You used to be able to get refurbished Kindles or iPads for a low dollar amount. That price has skyrocketed because the demand is there. Same thing with audiovisual hardware. It's kind of every man for himself trying to get the things that you need in order to do the best work possible. And also the extreme influx of technology has created a whole new form of pastoral care. So our pastoral care office has been the one leading the charge on reaching out to our older generations who are unfamiliar with technology, who have lots of questions. So really creating this new niche of pastoral care that we weren't really familiar with, because we were so much an in-person based area. We've made changes in our communications office because we went from having social media and a website being supplementary to being the form of communication, and it just required different skill sets than what we already had. And then when it comes to fundraising, it's a completely new environment. How do you craft an inspiring campaign when you know people are hurting financially, whether due to the economic downturn, whether due to increased medical costs, whether due to trying to help out additional family members? Your audience is in a very different place than they were, a year ago. Also, community engagement is so critical when it comes to fundraising. And so how can you effectively create that emotional investment in a virtual world? Over time, as far as the growth of a spiritual giver, they have to start through a process. Typically, they visit first, and then they become, maybe a routine worshiper. Then they find their point of engagement, whether that's through volunteering or through Bible studies or getting to know the community. That's where they develop that emotional investment in the community, and that leads to the level of giving that we need to see in order to support our annual budgets. And how do you avoid conversations around guilt and shame, that if people aren't in a position to pay their pledge, if they're not in a position to give more, if they're not in a position to really give it all, how do you communicate effectively in a way that doesn't inspire those feelings, but that lets them know that whatever they give is greatly appreciated and a blessing? And this kind of ties back to Laura Lynn's presentation. Communication is so key. Now is a time to be really transparent in what the needs of the church are. I know for us here at the cathedral, almost 67% of our annual budget comes from parishioner pledges. Another portion of the budget comes from the endowment, and then a significant portion comes from our alternative revenue streams, our parking garage, our restaurant, our preschool. None of them have been able to operate at the same level since March of last year. The restaurant and the school closed for several months. The parking garage is dependent upon downtown traffic, which has been almost non-existent. And so being really upfront and clear with our community that those revenue streams were a part of the budget and they have significantly declined. So sometimes I think when you have a larger facility or you have this sort of face of always a plethora of funds, it's hard for people to see the need, and that education really comes into communicating what the needs of the church truly are. So a couple of other techniques that I've thought through in regards to how to look at operations and personnel on the other side, or moving through a pandemic of this situation. Trim the fat, but leave room for growth. Talk to your vendors, look at your contracts, see what you can negotiate to offer yourself a little bit of respite. So one of the things that we did in the fall is we worked with our copier company. We were overpaying significantly for a guaranteed amount of print copies that we just weren't using because we're not printing 800 leaflets every Sunday. We're printing 200 leaflets every Sunday. We didn't print any leaflets for Easter last year. That was $7,000 in print savings that we found last year. So we went back to the copier company and were able to redesign our contract and renew it for a much lower rate that saves us several hundreds of dollars a month, but also has room for growth. I said, what is it going to cost us when we get back to regular operation? And being able to put that number in the budget and know that we would sort of stay at the same threshold. But your vendors are hurting too. They're willing to negotiate. They would much rather negotiate with you rather than lose your business. So that's just one way you can sort of look at trimming the fat, but make sure you leave room for growth, because tomorrow will not look like yesterday, and it's really hard to plan but how do you build that into your contracts? Make those essential changes. I know that as we've moved through the last year, there have been ways you've thought about, oh, one day this will be different. One day we'll make this change. Maybe we should look at reassigning or redesigning this person's job description. I say go ahead and do that. You can always go back, but your staff and your team should be able to recognize the needs in the moment and make those shifts. You can suggest them as temporary changes. We're going to try this out for 3 months. And in some cases, like I mentioned in our communications department, we just needed to make a total change because the skill set was no longer available for what we needed to do in that time. I know it's hard to think through, but after a year, if you're still wishing the same thing, make those essential changes. And then good stewardship starts with good administration, right? So the more you can save operationally, the more you can best utilize your personnel, the more funds that it frees up within the annual budget to do the ministry work, to put the dollars where they're needed most. And then that's what you communicate to the community. That's how you say, we're able to save program costs, but we're able to put that money back into disaster relief. We're able to put that money back into technology purchasing for lower income households. You're able to sort of change the conversation, but really starting with the campus, with the grounds, with the personnel, and making the best decisions possible. And when you're looking through how to make some of these essential changes to your campus, understand the lens that you're looking through, right? That what we thought we needed last March is very different than what we need this March. And how do you think through the needs of your community and what they're going to need right now, what they're going to need 6 months from now, and what they're going to need 1 year from now? And how do you plan flexibility into those designs? So that's what I have. I don't know if that answered anybody's questions.
Thank you, Karen. That was really good. And you seem to cover almost all of the areas very seamlessly. We were asking earlier in terms of getting some questions from you, and we have lots coming in. So thank you for that. I was going to pick up on a couple of them and then leave Laurelyn and Karen to pick up on the others. One of the questions was, I spoke a little bit about this earlier, but in terms, we finished our strategic plan in 2019 and then COVID came along. If you can actually take your strategy that you had in 2019 and go, what is it I'm truly trying to achieve over 3 or 5 years? Like, what is your vision? And then how can you actually break that down? And so my analogy would be, if you go off to Publix or Whole Foods or wherever you buy your food, you can go and buy a loaf that's whole, or you can buy a loaf that's already been sliced for you, or you can slice it up at home yourself. You need to take the vision, which is for 5 years, and turn it into a vision for a much shorter period of time. And even a year at the moment, it is too long. The problem is we don't know when everything's going to change for us in terms of COVID. Like Texas has just opened up. I'm very interested to see what happens there. But a lot of places are still closed down. And we'll probably only know with 2 or 3 months notice at the most when we can have more personal interaction, when we can actually have services inside. Here at Bethesda, we are fortunate enough to have a garden chapel outside by the koi pond, and we have an open air garth area. And so we run a service at 8 o'clock in the garden chapel, and we run a service at 10 o'clock in the garth, but we don't do any internal services. And we probably won't know until we get there what it would be. So it's almost like setting some parameters that says, these are the constraints for the next 90 days. Now, what can I do within those constraints? And really be aggressive in terms of challenging yourself as to what you can do. And the constraints will be different for all of us. As an example of something that we're doing here at Bethesda, we basically said on Easter Sunday, we want to allow 100% of the people to come for Easter Sunday services. And that would normally be about 2,000 people, like our members and then related family and friends and things like that. So the answer, which I think is mind-bogglingly difficult to actually make work, but the clergy have all bought into it, is that we will have 3 different places, one in the Garden Chapel, one in the Garth, and one in a South Lawn, with a clergy at each of them, and a verger at each of them, and altar guild at some of them, and the altar guild are sort of looking horrified at the moment, and they will do 3 services in the morning at each of the locations, at 7 o'clock, at 9 o'clock, and at 11 o'clock. And we'll also have a early morning service in the Garden Chapel at 6 o'clock for sunrise. And if that's not enough, we'll do another one at 12:30. So we would have never even thought doing something like this if COVID hadn't come along. Another example is we have a Boar's Head Festival in January, and we fill the church 3 times over. So that's 2,000 people. A lot of them are not members, and they come in and they see all these Americans dressed up in Tudor costumes from England and stuff. It's highly amusing for an Englishman. But it's really popular. We couldn't do that because it's inside the church. So instead, we had a pilgrimage around our grounds with different scenes of the Christmas story. And it's like, that went so well, we're going to do it again. So but think in a different way in terms of what you're going to do. In terms of ours, our stewardship side was long-term financial security as to what we want to do, so to build endowments. And what came out of that in terms of COVID was that we found it was much easier to ask for bigger numbers for capital campaigns than it was to ask for smaller numbers for the annual campaign. And therefore, we went and made some asks and raised 400,000 for new scholarships for children and 400,000 for upgrades to our organ. And so a learning lesson for our church, it may not apply to yours, was that big asks for capital items, very specific capital items, not going into an endowment, people were responding to very well. Now it's a small number of people, but it was much more successful than it had been previously. The annual campaign is not doing too bad. We're achieving about 90% in 2020 of what we achieved in 2019. I'd say that's pretty good going. We had to cut little bits back, but because of COVID, we had savings there. So that's one side of it. Another question was sort of what strategic considerations are most important for parishes to consider as we emerge from the pandemic? I would say there are 3 things, and it's really simple. Leadership, leadership, and leadership. If you can get that bit right, you have to encourage the leadership to move away from short-term reactive decision-making. Is this consistent with our vision? Yes or no? If the answer is no, there might be 10% chance it's still right to do this, but there's probably a big 80 to 90% chance that we should be doing it a different way. Use this as an opportunity to seek to innovate in all areas and challenge and disrupt, like challenge the decisions, not just from a financial perception, but from an operational perspective, from a communications perspective, from a strategic perspective. Challenge the decisions, not just where are we going to spend some money. And then we've already changed in a reactive way. So why don't we actually take on change in a truly disruptive way to actually go, what's the best way to go forwards? What is the best way to actually achieve some of these things? I'm not sure if I can do the next bit because I'm not sure if we can have 3 of us sharing our screen. Here we go. So here's a technique. It is just a technique. It's not you need a master's degree or anything like that. We all know in a strategy, we have our vision, mission, values, goals, priorities, communications, top right. If we get down to the planning piece, most of us build a strategic plan with targets, activities, timescales, resources, and communications. And a lot of strategic plans that I've looked at miss out 25%, which is the assumptions that go with it. What are the enablers to this strategy? What are the constraints? What's the quality level we want to achieve? And what's my backup plan if plan A doesn't work? I don't want to read through all the text, although probably I should, because otherwise you're going to read it while I talk. So defining the assumptions clearly is a means of addressing new and unexpected constraints. So truly what are your constraints at your church? And don't just say, oh, we don't have enough money at the moment, but really talk it through and make sure that the leadership as a whole has the same understanding of what that constraint is, and then do it with the others. And in terms of quality, like if you're clergy or altar guild, you need to put your hands in your ears at this point, but don't listen. If the candles are half an inch out on the altar, it is not the end of the world, okay? And so in terms of the quality, sometimes we need the quality the best we can, but sometimes we can actually live with less than that. And then what is our backup plan? The piece I have at the bottom right, well, maintaining your long-term vision, and you have to keep to that. Short-term constraints may change or evolve, and we know that. When will COVID allow us to do more, okay? Define the constraints and what you can achieve in terms of 90-day goals that are realistic but challenging, and make it happen. This is your option B. And then continue this. So from our perspective, we have 90-day plans, January, February, March. Shortly after we finish here, I will sit down with each of the ministries and then go, so what is going to be the 90-day plan for April, May, and June? And how much of what you were going to do in Q1 have you achieved? And by taking these very short-term looks at life, what we are finding is that the decision-making keeps the long-term vision right and moves us away from reactive. It's more like we've chopped the vision up into slices, like my analogy with a loaf of bread, but we're still working towards the vision. But the way we're going to get there, the disruptors, the challengers, things like that, are where we're making a change. And so I don't know if someone will make this available or whatever afterwards, but it's a simple tool that has worked with commercial companies, that has worked with nonprofits, like arts ones that I've worked with, and it works with churches, okay? And so I built this for my clients, but go and use it yourself. And there isn't lots of stuff behind it, but one thing behind it is, which is where I started off, which is if you don't get the right questions, the answers aren't going to come along. And some of the questions come from, what are the constraints in light of the vision I'm trying to achieve? Karen, sorry, you were going to say something.
No, that's fine. You totally, hang on one second. Okay, we're gonna try that again. Like you encapsulated what I say all the time, especially around managing a facility, is I need a short-term fix, but a long-term solution, right? I need to fix this broken pipe right now, but I need to know if the broken pipe is a symptom of a larger problem that needs a longer-term fix, that I need to go out and find proposals for, that I need to know how to run my HVAC in cold weather, but I also need to know if my HVAC is going to continuously fall apart over the next 3 months, because then I need to start working towards a long-term solution. And so I love your loaf of bread analogy, Paul, of like, you need the loaf of bread. And someone asked, is really now the time for long-term planning? And the answer is yes, because your church needs a direction. We were struggling at the early stages of COVID. One of my colleagues here said that it felt like the program staff were trying to swim upstream with a foot in 2 canoes, trying to plan for virtual, trying to plan for in-person, and not quite knowing which one they were going to achieve. And when we were able to say everything is going to be virtual, we're not going to do in-person except for worship, they were able to take their foot out of that other canoe, get in their canoe, and go forward. And then came October, we said, let's look at what spring looks like in person. And we'll plan for in person because we're hopeful, but we also now know what works virtually. And so if conditions deteriorate, we'll shift back to the virtual model, which is exactly what we had to do because of the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. So it's, I did have John, our control room D, prepare a poll just because I'm curious about where folks are in their strategic planning. So John, if you could release that poll, there's 3 options. Where are you in your next strategic plan? Have you already started, or you're about to start? Have you put it on hold, or are you proceeding with your current model? I think maybe in the last 2 to 3 years, everyone has either launched one, is in the process of one, or they're starting to have the conversation about starting one. So, and it's very interesting to see these poll results.
Karen, as the poll results come in, I just wanted to highlight a comment in the chat.
Sure.
I do think one of the things that has been a conversation I know with many of you is that we have been talking as a church about what the future of the church is and how we bring more people into the work of our church and our mission long before the pandemic hit. What has been helpful about the pandemic, to the extent there are silver linings to a very bad situation, is that it calls the question and accelerates the rate of change in ways that I think, to Karen's point, make it essential for good leaders to do long-term planning right now. And so the reality that we need to think about questions that were already very significant questions for ourselves as church leaders about what the future might look like, and how we might adapt to a changing context. Our fundamental mission, our fundamental visions have really not been affected by COVID, right? So I think what you will find, and this reinforces what Paul is saying, is fundamentally efforts to bring people to Christ are efforts to bring people to Christ under any circumstances. So however you articulate that particular set of mission, that doesn't change. What does change is how we do it. And we knew even before the pandemic that we were going to need to think about how to do that more effectively and differently as a church. And so what I think this does do now is call us to ask that question in a very sincere way. And as Karen was indicating, think about how we address our short-term needs while also looking at what those longer-term opportunities are. And we have been sensitive. I think this also offers a stop in time and a moment to pivot that is probably unparalleled. That for making even incremental decisions in most of our parishes is challenging. But if there has ever been a time when you're less likely to be questioned about eliminating service or making a significant change in your youth programs, the time when you re-enter our new normal is more likely to be that opportunity space. So on the question of, is this the time to plan? I've been encouraging leaders really, yes, to think about planning now, because the pace of changes have been accelerated by the reality of our context, and it will continue to be by the economic fallout of the pandemic in the years to come. And there's the opportunity now with this drastically changed mode of operations to re-enter the new normal in a different way, in a way that will be easier to explain to people. So I think it is well worth a good leader's time to create some space and time to do that kind of thinking.
Thanks, Laura Lynn. What our bishop said, I think it was in April, maybe May of last year, a letter came out. And one of the quotes from that letter was, "We have changed more in 6 weeks than we have in the last 6 years." And I thought that was a very true statement, just the true evolution of what we can and cannot do as a church, rapidly evolved, not just in the first 6 weeks of the pandemic, but truly in the last 12 months. So our poll results, we had 35% said they're about to start their strategic planning conversation. 28% have said that their strategic plans are currently on hold at this point. And then 38% had said they're going to proceed forward. So it's really interesting to, out of the sort of 67% of the participants who contributed to those poll results, it's kind of almost a third in each category. So there is no right answer, and there's not going to be. So we've only got about 5 minutes left. So if there's any point, Paul or Laura Lynn, that you wanted to touch on that you weren't able to.
I think we had a couple of comments coming in for the poll saying that some of the people would have so that they're reassessing their strategy as opposed to stopping, starting, or just continuing. And as Maury Wolf said quite rightly, the strategy needs to be reassessed all the time. And the technique I was showing of 90-day vision is not really changing the vision, but it's actually changing the path we take to get there almost every 90 days, as opposed to once a year and things like that. And I think even when we get past COVID, this may be a technique that churches can actually use going forwards, that once a quarter the vestry sits down and says, is this still the right path for us to get to our vision? Like once a year, they might review the vision, but once a quarter, they can actually decide whether or not the path they're taking, and it's the direction, the path they're taking, and how hard they're pressing the accelerator. And sometimes you want to get there as fast as possible, but you also don't want to leave too many people behind who actually are not part of what you're trying to do. So that's obviously an ongoing balancing act.
Yeah.
I'd also say that the comments that we've had in from everybody today is really good. And we appreciate that. This has become much better because we've actually been reacting to you as we're going along. So some of the things we prepared beforehand, we put a lot of work in, we absolutely ditched. And we focused in on what you were asking and the things you're interested in. And I think we've ended up, with your help, getting a much better thing. But instead of 3 heads, we had over 100. So that's pretty good.
Yeah. Laura Lynn, anything else you want to?
I actually think there was just an interesting comment in the chat about the cultural forces that are often at work within a parish and external factors related to whether it's demographic change or external, and how do those fit into a planning process? And I think a good planning process very much responds to those things, right? So one of the things that I think we're encouraging you to think about long-term planning now is exactly to respond to the external factors in our world that are changing the way in which we relate to each other, the economic and demographic realities, and that so that those kinds, that as you approach a planning process, to identify, in the business school speak, the SWOT analysis, right? That would show you what is happening in your external world and in the culture of your internal organization that will inform your path going forward. And that those are considerations that should be an integrated part of those conversations as you think about a planning process. And even more importantly now as the world changes so dramatically.
Well said. Thank you, Laura Lynn.
Well, at this time, I'm going to thank everyone for joining us for this informative discussion. I'd like to thank Karen, Paul, and Laura Lynn for their contribution this morning, as well as John in the control room. Please continue this discussion on the Whova application, and we hope that you'll take a moment to fill out the short survey that's available in the chat box. I'd also like to invite you to join us for a conversation with Reverend Dr. Sam Wells and Reverend Azaria France Williams, sponsored by the Hard Edge Network. That's the next session coming up. Thanks again for joining us this morning.
Thank you.